The air inside the sterile clinic felt heavy, though the room itself was impeccably clean. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the muffled sounds of distant footsteps in the hallway were the only audible distractions. Choi Hyun-bin sat rigidly on the edge of a leather chair, his tailored suit creasing slightly as his hands rested, clasped, on his knees. The polished surface of the desk before him reflected the impassive expression of the doctor sitting opposite him, a man whose tone was practiced in delivering bad news. "You have 6 months, at most," the doctor said, his words clinical, as if rehearsed. His hands adjusted a stack of papers detailing the diagnosis, but the details no longer mattered to Hyun-bin. 6 months. The words echoed in his mind, like the distant chime of a clock signaling the passing of time. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window behind the doctor, the city of Seoul sprawled endlessly, its skyline a mesmerizing tangle of glass and steel. Hyun-bin's gaze lingered there briefly, observing the world that carried on oblivious to his impending end. He returned his focus to the man before him, forcing himself to maintain composure. "And you're certain there's nothing else?" His voice was calm, almost indifferent, betraying none of the turmoil brewing beneath. The doctor hesitated, just for a moment. "Your condition is exceptionally rare. Treatments exist, but in your case, they would only prolong suffering. It's best to focus on making the time you have left meaningful." "Meaningful," Hyun-bin repeated, the word foreign and hollow in his mouth. He rose abruptly, his tall frame casting a shadow over the sterile white desk. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his leather shoes striking the polished floor with sharp precision. The corridor outside the clinic was brightly lit, but to Hyun-bin, it felt suffocating. Each step he took reverberated like a drumbeat, loud and incessant, matching the frantic rhythm of his heart. He passed nurses, their polite smiles unnoticed, and entered the private elevator waiting at the end of the hall. Inside, the reflective walls of the elevator showed him his own face, sharp features, immaculately styled hair, and dark eyes that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing within. This was Choi Hyun-bin, CEO of Choi Pharmaceuticals, a man respected, envied, even feared in the business world. Yet now, staring at his reflection, he saw a man hollowed by inevitability. As the elevator descended, memories surfaced unbidden. His father's voice, stern and commanding, echoed from his childhood. "The legacy of our family is your responsibility. There is no room for weakness." His mother's gentle hands on his shoulders, her whisper of encouragement. "Remember, Hyun-bin, the world may test you, but your heart will always guide you." The chime of the elevator door opening snapped him back to the present. The lobby of the clinic was quiet, with only the faint murmur of a television in the corner. Hyun-bin stepped out into the cold evening air. The bustling city greeted him with a cacophony of sounds: car horns, distant laughter, the faint melody of a street performer playing a guitar. Life continued, oblivious to his crisis. A black sedan waited at the curb, the driver stepping out to open the door. Hyun-bin paused before entering, his hand gripping the cool metal of the doorframe. For a moment, he considered telling someone, his sister Ji-young, his closest confidant, but the words refused to form. Inside the car, silence enveloped him. He leaned back, his fingers loosening the knot of his tie as he stared out at the blur of city lights. His mind churned, dissecting the doctor's words, replaying them as if they might change with repetition. 6 months. The car stopped at the entrance to his penthouse. Hyun-bin exited, ignoring the concerned greeting of the doorman, and took the private elevator to his home. The door slid open to reveal a sprawling space of modern elegance, minimalist furniture, muted tones of gray and black, and walls of glass that showcased the dazzling city below. Yet tonight, the space felt emptier than ever. Hyun-bin crossed to the bar, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and stood by the window. The amber liquid caught the light, gleaming in contrast to the darkness of the room. As he raised the glass to his lips, a thought struck him, sharp and unwelcome. Everything he had built, his empire, his wealth, his reputation, none of it would matter in 6 months. For the first time in years, his chest tightened, not with anger or pride, but with the quiet ache of regret. The sound of his phone buzzing broke the silence. He ignored it, letting it vibrate against the marble countertop until it stopped. Instead, he set the glass down untouched and stared out into the night. "Meaningful," he murmured again, his voice soft and uncertain. For a man who had everything, the concept felt alien. As the city lights flickered below, Hyunbin made an unspoken decision. The weight of his diagnosis lingered, but beneath it, something began to stir, a faint, fragile desire to find a purpose before his time ran out. The sky above Seoul stretched pale and cloudy, its muted tones casting a somber light over the city. Choi Hyunbin stood in his corner office on the top floor of Choi Pharmaceuticals' gleaming headquarters, gazing out at the sprawling urban expanse below. His reflection in the thick glass mirrored his composed exterior, but inside, the chaos of his thoughts churned ceaselessly. The office was a perfect embodiment of his life, meticulously organized, modern, and devoid of warmth. The faint scent of polished wood lingered in the air, mixing with the quiet hum of the city below. His desk was a masterpiece of minimalism, holding only the essentials: a sleek laptop, a fountain pen, and a photo frame that faced away from him. As he stared at the cityscape, memories of his father filled the silence. The patriarch of the Choi family had built this empire from nothing, driving himself and his son to the brink of perfection. "Legacy is everything, Hyunbin," his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Your duty is not just to succeed, but to ensure the Choi name remains untouchable." The words had guided Hyunbin throughout his career, shaping him into a man respected and feared in equal measure. Yet now, with the certainty of his mortality pressing down on him, they felt like chains. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Without turning, he answered, "Come in." The door opened, and his sister, Ji-young, stepped in, carrying a folder under her arm. She was a stark contrast to the cold rigidity of the office. Dressed in soft earth tones, with her warm smile and delicate features, Ji-young radiated an effortless charm. "Hyunbin," she greeted, her voice light but tinged with concern. She walked toward him, placing the folder on his desk. "I thought you'd want to review this before the board meeting tomorrow." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm stepping back from the company," he said abruptly, his voice calm but resolute. Ji-young froze, her brows knitting in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his tone measured, "I won't be attending the meeting. Or any meetings, for that matter. It's time for someone else to take the reins." Her eyes searched his face, trying to decipher his sudden declaration. "This isn't like you. Is something wrong?" Hyunbin hesitated. For a moment, the truth hovered on the tip of his tongue, but the weight of his pride held it back. "I've been running this company long enough," he said instead. "It's time I focus on other priorities." Ji-young didn't believe him. "Priorities? What priorities? You've sacrificed everything for this company, Hyunbin. If you step back now, what was it all for?" He turned away, his gaze returning to the skyline. "What was it all for?" he murmured, almost to himself. "That's what I intend to find out." Silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Ji-young, sensing his unwillingness to explain further, sighed softly. "If you're serious about this, you'll need to address the board. Kang Do-jin won't waste a second positioning himself as your successor." At the mention of Do-jin, Hyunbin's jaw tightened. Do-jin was everything Hyunbin despised in a leader: ruthless without integrity, ambitious without principle. "I'll handle Do-jin," he said firmly. "Just ensure the company stays on course." Ji-young nodded reluctantly, but the unease in her eyes lingered. "If you need anything, Hyunbin, you know I'm here." He didn't respond, and she left quietly, leaving him alone once more. Later that night, the city below buzzed with life as Hyunbin sat in the dim glow of his office, staring at the photo frame he had turned away earlier. Slowly, he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cool glass before he flipped it over. The image was of him and his mother, taken when he was a boy. Her smile was radiant, her arms wrapped around him protectively. "Focus on what truly matters, Hyunbin," she had often told him, her voice soft but resolute. He placed the frame back on the desk and exhaled deeply. For years he had ignored that advice, consumed by the pursuit of power and success. But now, with time slipping away, her words held a new urgency. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a notification about a volunteer opportunity at a local animal shelter, a cause his mother had passionately supported in her lifetime. Hyunbin stared at the screen for a moment, before clicking on the link. The shelter was struggling to stay afloat, and was urgently seeking volunteers. It was a small, unassuming place on the outskirts of the city, worlds away from his high-rise office. The idea was absurd, reckless even, but as he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, a faint sense of clarity began to take shape. He didn't know what he was searching for, but something told him it wouldn't be found in boardrooms or financial reports. Tomorrow, he would leave the world he had built behind. The road leading to the animal shelter was lined with trees, their bare branches swaying lightly in the cold breeze of late autumn. The city's noise was replaced by a stillness that felt alien to Choi Hyunbin. He sat in the back seat of a modest car, far removed from the luxurious sedans he was used to, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. The scent of damp earth filtered through the slightly open window, mingling with the crispness of the air. The driver pulled up to a small building with faded yellow paint and a sign above the door that read, "Paws and Hearts Shelter." It was modest and unassuming, surrounded by a patchy yard with a rusted fence. The faint sound of barking and the occasional chirp of birds filled the air. It was a world apart from the glossy skyscrapers and polished offices he had left behind. Hyunbin stepped out, dressed in simple clothing, a plain sweater and jeans that felt foreign on his body. He had left behind his tailored suits and Rolex watches in an attempt to blend in. Even so, there was no mistaking the air of refinement he carried. "Are you sure about this, sir?" the driver asked, his tone hesitant. "Yes," Hyunbin replied curtly, his eyes scanning the shelter. "You can leave now." The driver hesitated, but eventually nodded, leaving him standing at the entrance. Hyunbin took a deep breath and walked through the gate, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Inside the shelter, the space was filled with the unmistakable smells of animals, wet fur, hay, and disinfectant. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, though they were chipped in places. A small reception desk sat near the entrance, cluttered with papers and a donation jar half filled with coins. "Can I help you?" a voice called out from the back. A woman emerged from a hallway, her hands wiping on a towel. She stopped mid-step when she saw him, her brow furrowing slightly. This was Yoon Ha-yoon. She had an air of effortless charm about her, despite her clearly busy and slightly disheveled appearance. Her dark brown hair was tied into a messy ponytail, with a few loose strands framing her face. Her eyes, warm and expressive, gave her a natural beauty that didn't rely on makeup or sophistication. "I'm here to volunteer," Hyunbin said, his voice calm but firm. Ha-yoon looked him up and down, her skepticism evident. "You? Volunteer?" "Yes," he replied, his tone unwavering. "You don't exactly look like the volunteering type," she said, crossing her arms. "Do you even know how to handle animals?" Hyunbin hesitated, unsure how to respond. In truth, he had never been near an animal for more than a passing glance. His childhood was filled with lessons in business and etiquette, not playtime with pets. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. Haun raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Fine, follow me." She led him through the shelter, her steps brisk. The narrow hallway was lined with small rooms, each housing animals of various sizes. Dogs barked excitedly as they passed, their tails wagging, while a few cats observed quietly from perches. "This is where we keep the supplies," Haun said, stopping at a storage room. "You'll be cleaning out the kennels and refilling water bowls. Can you handle that?" "I can handle it," he replied, his jaw tightening slightly at her condescending tone. She handed him a pair of gloves and a bucket. "Great. Let's see what you've got, Mr. Volunteer." The next few hours were a humbling experience for Hyunbin. The work was physically demanding and far removed from anything he had done before. The gloves did little to mask the unpleasant sensation of cleaning, and the barking of the dogs created a constant din. Hyun watched him from a distance, occasionally giving instructions. She couldn't deny there was something unusual about him. His posture was too poised, his movements too precise for someone accustomed to manual labor. And yet, despite her doubts, he didn't complain. At one point, a small, scruffy dog approached him, wagging its tail hesitantly. Hyunbin paused, unsure of how to respond. The dog barked softly, tilting its head as if waiting for him to act. "He likes you," Haun said, surprising him. She stood nearby, her expression softening slightly. "I doubt that," Hyunbin replied, his tone dry. Haun crouched next to the dog, scratching behind its ears. "Animals don't lie about who they like. You might not realize it yet, but they'll teach you a lot about trust." Her words lingered in the air as she stood and walked away, leaving him with the dog still wagging its tail at his feet. As the day went on, Hyunbin began to notice things he hadn't before. The way the animals responded to Hyun's presence, the warmth in her voice when she spoke to them, and the quiet determination she carried despite the evident struggles of running the shelter. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, he found himself standing outside, watching Hyun feed a group of dogs. The gentle breeze carried the faint scent of pine from the nearby trees, and for the first time in what felt like years, a sense of calm washed over him. This was nothing like the world he knew, and yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, it felt like a world worth exploring. The morning air at the shelter was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and dew-soaked grass. Sunlight spilled over the small yard, where the animals were beginning to stir. Choi Hyunbin stepped outside, holding a metal bucket filled with fresh water. The weight of it pressed into his hands, a sensation foreign, but oddly grounding. "Careful with that," Hyun called out from across the yard, her voice laced with both amusement and instruction. She crouched near a row of kennels, her sleeves rolled up, exposing arms lightly dusted with dirt from the morning chores. Her hair was tied back into a low bun, though a few loose strands clung to her damp forehead. Hyunbin shot her a glance but said nothing. Instead, he focused on pouring the water into a trough for the waiting dogs. As he did, one of them, a wiry terrier with floppy ears, jumped excitedly, splashing water back onto him. The icy splash hit his face and neck, eliciting a sharp intake of breath. From her spot near the kennels, Ha-Yoon burst into laughter. It was bright and unrestrained, the kind of laugh that carried across the yard and made even the dogs wag their tails. "You're supposed to pour the water in the trough, not wear it," she teased, standing and wiping her hands on her jeans. Hyunbin straightened, his expression a mix of irritation and bemusement. "I'll remember that next time," he replied dryly, brushing the water off his face with the edge of his sleeve. Ha-Eun walked over, still smiling, and reached out to adjust the bucket in his hand. Her fingers brushed his momentarily, warm and steady against the cool metal. "You're doing better than I expected," she admitted, her tone softening. "Most people quit after the first day." "I'm not most people," he said, the faintest hint of pride in his voice. She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "No, you're not." Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of understanding passing between them before she stepped back and returned to her work. The day unfolded with a quiet rhythm. Ha-eun moved effortlessly through her tasks, tending to the animals with a tenderness that seemed second nature. Hyunbin observed her from a distance as he worked, noting the way her presence seemed to calm even the most restless creatures. At one point, he found himself helping her with a particularly skittish dog, a young mutt with uneven patches of fur. The dog trembled as Ha-eun approached, its large eyes filled with mistrust. "Give me your hand," she said, holding her own out toward him. Hyunbin hesitated but complied, extending his hand toward her. She took it gently, guiding it toward the dog. "Keep your movements slow," she instructed, her voice low and soothing. The dog sniffed cautiously, then licked his fingers once before retreating. "There you go," Ha-eun said, smiling. "See? Trust takes time, but it's worth it." Hyunbin nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "You're good at this," he said, the words coming uncharacteristically easily. She looked up at him, surprised. "I've had a lot of practice. Animals are honest. They don't hide how they feel. It makes it easier to understand them." There was an unspoken meaning in her words, one that tugged at something deep inside him. Later that evening, after the last of the animals had been fed and the yard cleaned, Ha-eun sat on the steps of the shelter's small porch, sipping from a chipped mug. Hyunbin joined her, lowering himself onto the step beside her. The sky was a canvas of warm oranges and deep purples, the air thick with the scent of pine and the faint sound of crickets. It was a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal luxury of his penthouse. "Do you ever stop?" he asked, watching as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She glanced at him, her expression contemplative. "Not really. There's always something that needs to be done." "And what about you?" he pressed. "Don't you ever think about leaving this place? Doing something else?" Ha-eun shook her head, her gaze distant. "This isn't just a job for me. It's my way of giving back. These animals didn't ask to be abandoned or hurt, but they were. If I don't take care of them, who will?" Her words carried a quiet conviction that struck him deeply. He thought of his own life, of the countless hours spent building an empire that now felt meaningless. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he admitted after a moment. She smiled faintly. "And you're not as bad as I thought you'd be." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The warmth of the evening wrapped around them, and for the first time in years, Hyunbin felt a sliver of peace. As the stars began to dot the sky, Ha-eun stood, stretching her arms above her head. "Come on, Mr. Volunteer. There's still more to do tomorrow." He followed her inside, his steps lighter than they had been that morning. The shelter buzzed with activity the next morning. The barking of excited dogs blended with the scrape of food bowls being filled, while sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the modest building. Outside, a chill hung in the air, the kind that nipped at fingertips and noses, signaling the early arrival of winter. Choi Hyunbin, now more accustomed to the daily tasks, moved with a quiet efficiency as he cleaned out the kennels. His movements, while still somewhat stiff, were less tentative than before. The wiry terrier from the day before trailed him closely, its tail wagging as if Hyunbin's presence had already become a familiar comfort. From the corner of his eye, he watched Ha-eun kneeling by a crate, cradling a tiny, shivering puppy in her arms. Her voice, low and soothing, carried across the yard as she whispered words of encouragement to the frightened animal. There was an ease to her care, an unspoken connection with the creatures she nurtured. For a moment, he allowed himself to pause and simply observe her. The way the sunlight caught her hair, creating a soft halo, and the gentle curve of her lips as she smiled down at the puppy. It was a vision of warmth that starkly contrasted with the cold world he had come from. "Don't just stand there," Ha-un called out, breaking his reverie. Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "We're on a schedule, remember?" Caught off guard, Hyunbin cleared his throat and returned to his work, but the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. As the day wore on, a somber tension began to creep into the air. Ha-yun's usual brightness seemed dimmed, her smiles less frequent. She spent more time than usual shuffling through papers in the cramped office, her brows knitted in worry. Curiosity gnawed at Hyunbin, but he hesitated to ask. The walls she had built around her personal life were as sturdy as the ones he had constructed for himself. It wasn't until later that evening, when the animals had settled and the shelter was quiet, that he found her sitting at the small wooden desk in the office. The light from an old desk lamp illuminated the dark circles under her eyes as she pored over stacks of documents and unpaid bills. "What's all this?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ha-yun looked up, startled. For a moment she seemed ready to brush him off, but the weight of her exhaustion kept her from hiding the truth. "Finances," she admitted, her voice tight. "The shelter's barely staying afloat. Donations have slowed down, and we're behind on rent. If we can't catch up soon..." Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Because it's not your problem. I've been handling this place on my own for years. I'll figure it out." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater struggling to warm the space. Hyunbin's gaze shifted to the papers on the desk. The overdue notices, the pleas for donations that had gone unanswered. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," he said finally, his voice softer now. Ha-eun laughed bitterly. "Life doesn't exactly ask for permission before throwing you into the deep end." Her words struck a chord in him, though she couldn't possibly know why. That night, as Ha-eun locked up the shelter, Hyunbin lingered outside, his breath visible in the chilly air. He scrolled through his phone, searching for information about the shelter. It didn't take long for him to find the details: its funding history, donation patterns, and the growing financial shortfall. He felt a familiar urge stir within him, the instinct to solve a problem, to control the outcome. He could cover the shelter's expenses with a single call, a few clicks. It would barely make a dent in his wealth. But he hesitated. Ha-yun's pride was as fierce as her determination. She would never accept his help if she knew the truth about him. The memory of her words earlier echoed in his mind. Trust takes time, but it's worth it. The next day, Hyunbin arrived early, surprising even himself. The sky was still streaked with shades of lavender and pink, and frost coated the grass. Ha-eun was already outside, preparing food for the animals. She glanced up as he approached, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You're early," she said, brushing her hands off on her coat. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their breath visible in the morning chill. "Ha-eun," he said after a while, his voice careful. "Have you ever thought about asking for more help? Reaching out to larger organizations, maybe even companies?" She paused, her hands stilling over the food bowl she was filling. "I've tried," she said quietly. "But shelters like this, they don't get much attention. People donate to places with bigger names, fancier campaigns. We're just forgotten." Her words settled heavily in the air between them. "You're not forgotten," he said after a moment, his voice firm. "Not by the animals, Not by the people who care about what you're doing here. Hyun looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she smiled, though it didn't fully reach her eyes. "Thanks," she said softly. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hyunbin found himself staring at the shelter from a distance. For years, he had operated in a world where problems were solved with money, power, or influence. But here, amidst the warmth of the animals and the quiet strength of Ha-un, he was beginning to understand that some things couldn't be fixed so easily. Still, the thought of losing the shelter, losing this fragile new connection he had found, was unbearable. He turned away, his hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't let it happen. Even if it meant going against her wishes, even if it meant exposing truths he wasn't ready to share, he would find a way to help her. The frost that dusted the ground overnight glistened under the pale morning sun. Choi Hyunbin arrived at the shelter before dawn, his mind heavy with unresolved thoughts. The quiet hum of his car's engine faded into silence as he stepped onto the gravel path, the crisp air biting at his skin. The shelter was still, save for a few restless barks from the dogs. Inside, the lights were dim, and the faint smell of disinfectant mingled with the earthy scent of hay. Hyunbin made his way to the small office, where he knew Ha-un would be, poring over her endless stack of bills and paperwork. When he entered, she barely glanced up from her desk. The soft glow of the desk lamp highlighted the exhaustion etched into her features, the dark circles under her eyes, the strain in her posture. "You're here early again," she remarked, her voice flat but not unkind. "You're starting to make me look bad." "I thought you'd be used to hard work by now," he replied, attempting to inject lightness into his tone. Her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, but it quickly faded as her focus returned to the papers in front of her. "What's all this?" he asked, stepping closer to the desk. "More bills," she said with a sigh, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this place running. Every day feels like a losing battle." Her words struck a chord deep within him, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. But there was something else too. An overwhelming urge to protect her, to shield her from the burdens that threatened to crush her. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. Ha-un glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. A man appeared in the doorway, a delivery worker carrying a box stamped with the logo of a well-known pet supply company. "Special delivery for Paws and Hearts Shelter," the man announced, setting the box down on the desk. Ha-un frowned, clearly puzzled. "We didn't order anything." "It's already paid for," the man replied, handing her a clipboard. "Just need your signature." She hesitated, glancing at the box and then at Hyunbin, who stood silently beside her. Reluctantly, she signed the form and watched as the man left. "What is this?" she muttered, tearing open the box. Inside were high-quality supplies, food, bedding, medicine, all the things the shelter desperately needed but couldn't afford. Her brows furrowed as she examined the contents. "Who?" Hyunbin remained silent, his hands tucked into his pockets as he avoided her gaze. "Hyunbin," she said sharply, turning to him. "Did you do this?" For a moment, he considered denying it, but the look in her eyes, an uneasy mix of suspicion and disbelief, kept him from lying. "It doesn't matter who did it," he said instead, his voice measured. "The shelter needs these supplies." Her face hardened. "It matters to me. Did you use your own money for this?" "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. Ha-un's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "Why? Why would you go behind my back like this?" "Because you needed help," he said, his voice rising slightly. "And you're too stubborn to ask for it." "I didn't ask for your charity," she snapped, her hands clenched at her sides. "This isn't charity," he retorted. "It's support. You shouldn't have to do this alone." Her eyes burned with frustration. "You don't get it, do you? This shelter means everything to me. Every struggle, every sacrifice. It's all part of what makes it worth fighting for. You can't just throw money at the problem and expect it to go away." The weight of her words hung between them, thick and oppressive. For the first time, Hyunbin felt the sting of rejection, not just of his help, but of the part of himself he had tried to offer. "I was only trying to help," he said softly, his tone stripped of its usual confidence. Ha-eun exhaled sharply, turning away from him. "You don't understand. You can't understand." The rest of the day passed in strained silence. Ha-eun avoided him as much as possible, throwing herself into her work with a single-minded focus. The animals, unaware of the tension, greeted them both with the same unrelenting enthusiasm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shelter yard, Hyunbin found himself alone near the kennels. The wiry terrier that had taken a liking to him padded over, its tail wagging hesitantly. He crouched down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "At least you don't judge me," he muttered with a faint smile. The sound of footsteps behind him made him straighten. Ha-eun stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I overreacted," she admitted quietly. "I know you meant well." "It's fine," he said, though the tightness in his chest betrayed his words. She hesitated, then took a step closer. "It's not fine. I've been on my own for so long that I don't know how to accept help, even when I need it. But you don't have to do this." Her words were softer now, less defensive, but they still carried the weight of unspoken questions. Questions about why he was here, why he cared so much. "Maybe I do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Their eyes met, the distance between them shrinking in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous. But before either of them could say more, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the moment. Hyun glanced at the screen and sighed. "I have to take this. We'll talk later, okay?" He nodded, watching as she walked away, her silhouette fading into the twilight. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Hyunbin sat alone, the terrier curled up beside him. His mind raced with doubts, guilt, and the ever-present shadow of the truth he hadn't yet revealed. For the first time, he wondered if his presence here was doing more harm than good. The crisp chill of early winter had settled over the shelter, frosting the edges of the yard's brittle grass and painting the windows with delicate patterns of ice. The animals stirred lazily, their breath visible in the cold air as Ha-eun moved among them, her steps hurried but deliberate. Inside the small office, Choi Hyunbin sat in silence. The warmth of the heater couldn't reach him as he stared at the papers scattered across the desk. Financial reports, donation lists, and veterinary invoices. He wasn't focused on any of them. Instead, his mind churned with thoughts of the previous day's confrontation. The anger in Ha-eun's voice, the frustration in her eyes. It had lingered with him all night. She had accepted his apology, but something between them had shifted. Ha-eun entered the office suddenly, breaking his reverie. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable as she held her phone tightly in her hand. "Hyunbin," she began, her voice strained. "There's someone here to see you." He frowned, confused. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, and a familiar figure strode into the room. Ji Young. Clad in a tailored coat that clung elegantly to her form, Ji Young radiated the effortless confidence that was the hallmark of their family. Her sharp gaze swept the room, taking in the modest surroundings before landing on her brother. "What are you doing here?" Hyunbin asked, his voice cold and defensive. "I should be asking you the same thing," Ji Young replied, her tone clipped. She glanced at Ha-eun, who stood frozen in the doorway, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I'll leave you two to talk, Ha-un said finally, stepping out and closing the door behind her. The silence in the room stretched thin as Ji-young crossed her arms and leveled her gaze at him. You've been ignoring my calls. I had to find you myself. I've been busy, he replied, his voice dismissive. Busy playing volunteer? She retorted, her eyes narrowing. What is this, Hyun-bin? Some kind of escape? You disappear from the company, leave me to deal with Kang Do-jin, and now I find out you've been hiding out in a dog shelter? It's none of your concern, he said flatly. It is my concern when the board is asking questions I can't answer, Ji-young snapped. Do you have any idea what's at stake? Do-jin is circling like a vulture, waiting for any excuse to seize control. And you're just letting it happen? Her words stung, but Hyun-bin didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes dark and unreadable. Let him have it, he said quietly. Ji-young blinked, taken aback. What are you talking about? I don't have time for this, he replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. The company, the board, Do-jin. It doesn't matter anymore. For a moment, Ji-young just stared at him. Then, realization dawned, her expression softening with something that looked like fear. Hyun-bin, what's going on? He didn't answer. Don't shut me out, she pleaded, her voice breaking. You're my brother. If something's wrong, I need to know. The vulnerability in her tone cut through his defenses. He turned away, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he said, I'm dying. The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Ji-young's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. No, that can't be true. It's true, he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. 6 months if I'm lucky. The doctors were very clear. Ji-young sank into the chair across from him, her composure crumbling. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want you to know, he admitted. I didn't want anyone to know. Her tears fell silently as she reached out to grasp his hand. You don't have to go through this alone. I already am, he said, pulling his hand away. And that's how it should be. Outside the office, Ha-yoon stood near the kennels, her thoughts racing. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the raised voices had carried through the thin walls, fragments of their conversation reaching her ears. Dying. The word echoed in her mind, stark and unrelenting. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The way Hyun-bin carried himself, the flashes of sadness in his eyes, the way he seemed to throw himself into the shelter work with quiet desperation. She had sensed that he was hiding something, but she had never imagined it would be something like this. The office door opened, and Ji-young stepped out, her face streaked with tears. She gave Ha-un a polite nod before walking briskly toward her car. Hyun-bin emerged moments later, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. You knew I was hiding something, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Ha-un nodded, her chest tightening. I didn't know it was this. His gaze dropped to the ground. It doesn't change anything. I didn't come here for sympathy. I'm not giving you sympathy, she replied, her tone firm. But I deserve to know why you're really here, why you chose this place. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. Because this place, and you, are the first things that have felt real to me in years. The honesty in his voice left her momentarily speechless. But before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the cold twilight. The days that followed felt heavier, colder, as if the air itself was burdened by unspoken truths. Ha-yoon moved through the shelter mechanically, her mind consumed by the weight of what she now knew. The once lively rhythm of the shelter, the barking dogs, the scurrying cats, seemed muted. Choi Hyun-bin kept his distance. He worked quietly, avoiding unnecessary conversation and slipping away before the day's tasks were complete. Their interactions were brief, tense, and charged with emotions neither dared to confront. One evening, after the animals had been fed and the shelter was silent, Ha-un found herself sitting on the porch steps, her breath visible in the frosty air. The stars glittered above her, but their beauty offered no comfort. The memory of Hyunbin's words haunted her. Because this place, and you, are the first things that have felt real to me in years. She thought of his hands, steady and precise as he worked alongside her, of the rare moments when his guarded demeanor cracked, revealing a man searching for something he couldn't name. She thought of the fragility in his voice when he spoke of his illness. Her chest tightened with an ache she couldn't suppress. She was angry that he had kept the truth from her, angry that he had entered her life only to leave so soon. But beneath the anger was something deeper: sorrow. The next morning, Ha-un approached the small office, her resolve hardening. She found Hyunbin there, sitting at the desk, his fingers idly tracing the edge of a paper. He looked up when she entered, his face calm but weary. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. He leaned back in his chair, regarding her cautiously. "I thought we said everything that needed to be said." "No," she replied firmly. "You said what you wanted to say. Now it's my turn." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You can't just drop a truth like that and expect me to act like it doesn't matter. It does matter. To me, to this place, to everything we've been building here." "This was never about me," he said, his voice low. "It's about the shelter, about the animals." "That's a lie," she shot back. "It's about you too. Whether you want to admit it or not, you've become part of this place. And whether you like it or not, you've become part of my life." Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. For a moment, Hyunbin said nothing, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't articulate. Finally he stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. "That's exactly why I need to leave," he said quietly. Ha-un's breath caught. "What?" "This place. You've given me more than I deserve," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can't stay. I won't let you carry the weight of what's coming." "You think leaving will make it easier?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It won't. If you walk away now, you'll take everything we've built here and throw it away." "I'm protecting you," he said, his tone firm but pained. "No," she replied, tears welling in her eyes. "You're running away." That evening, Hyunbin packed his things in silence. The small room he had called his own for the past weeks looked bare, stripped of the few belongings he had brought with him. Ha-un watched from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wanted to say something, to stop him, but the words wouldn't come. When he finally turned to leave, he paused, his eyes meeting hers one last time. "Thank you," he said softly. "For everything." She didn't respond, her throat too tight to speak. And then he was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading into the cold night air. The shelter felt emptier without him. Days turned into weeks, and though Ha-un continued her work, a part of her felt hollow. She tried to convince herself that it was better this way, that letting him go was the right thing to do. But late at night, when the world was quiet, she couldn't stop herself from wondering where he was, or if he was thinking of her too. In a quiet hospital room on the other side of the city, Hyunbin sat by the window, staring out at the gray skyline. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the faint beeping of monitors was a constant reminder of the time slipping away. He thought of the shelter, of the animals, of Ha-un. The memory of her voice, fierce and unwavering, echoed in his mind. "You've become part of my life." The realization hit him like a blow. He had walked away not to protect her, but to protect himself. And in doing so, he had lost the one thing that made his final days feel meaningful. As the first snow of the season began to fall, both Hyunbin and Ha-eun found themselves staring out at the same sky, miles apart, but connected by the ache of something unfinished. The first snowfall blanketed the city in a quiet stillness. The streets of Seoul were subdued, the usual cacophony of car horns and bustling crowds muffled by the layer of white. At the shelter, the frost-coated fences shimmered under the pale winter sun. Yoon Ha-yeon stood near the kennels, her breath visible in the chilly air, her thoughts miles away. The days since Choi Hyunbin's departure had been heavy, each one marked by an absence she couldn't shake. She had tried to bury herself in work, focusing on the animals and the mounting challenges of keeping the shelter afloat. But every empty corner, every task he had once shared, was a painful reminder of his absence. She glanced down at her phone, scrolling through messages from donors and volunteers, but her attention faltered. Her fingers hesitated over his name in her call log. He hadn't called, and neither had she. Why does it feel like he's still here? She wondered, her chest tightening. Elsewhere in the city, Hyunbin stood in the hospital lobby, leaning heavily against the cool marble wall. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the distant hum of a vending machine filled the air around him. He had just come from another round of tests, the results as grim as always. The doctor's words from earlier echoed in his mind. It's best to focus on the time you have left and how you want to spend it. He stared at the crumpled discharge papers in his hand, his thoughts drifting to the shelter. To Ha-eun. The memory of her voice, strong and raw with emotion, haunted him. If you walk away now, you'll throw it all away. He clenched his fists, the ache in his chest growing unbearable. He had convinced himself that leaving was the right thing to do. But now, he couldn't escape the emptiness it left behind. That evening, as twilight cast long shadows over the shelter, Ha-eun was closing up for the night when she heard the familiar crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. She froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the sound. There he was. Choi Hyunbin stood at the gate, his tall frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights. He looked thinner, the lines of his face sharper, but his presence was as commanding as ever. Snowflakes clung to his hair and the shoulders of his coat, and his breath misted in the icy air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to pause, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the trees. "You're back," Ha-eun said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm back," he replied, his tone steady, but filled with something unspoken. She opened the gate, letting him in, and they stood there for a moment, face to face. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because I was wrong," he admitted, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I thought leaving was the right thing to do, that it would protect you. But all it did was leave me empty." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "You hurt me, Hyunbin. When you walked away, you made me feel like none of it mattered." "It matters," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You matter. More than anything I've ever known." The honesty in his voice broke something inside her, and she let out a shaky breath. "Then why didn't you stay?" "Because I was afraid," he confessed. "Afraid of what you'd think of me when you found out the truth. Afraid of what it would mean for you to care about someone who's running out of time." She looked up at him then, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said, her voice strong despite the tears streaking her cheeks. "I care about you, Hyunbin. Whether you have 6 months or 60 years, that doesn't change." Her words hit him like a wave, washing over the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, He allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something more, something worth fighting for. They spent the rest of the evening together in the small office, the warmth of the heater wrapping around them as they talked. For the first time, Hyun-bin opened up fully, sharing the details of his diagnosis and the fears he had tried so hard to suppress. Ha-eun listened intently, her hand resting on his, grounding him as he spoke. In return, she shared her own struggles, her fears of losing the shelter, the sleepless nights spent worrying about the animals, and the sense of loneliness that had haunted her long before he arrived. By the time the conversation ended, the walls between them had crumbled, leaving only the raw, honest connection they had both been searching for. The next morning, the shelter felt alive in a way it hadn't in weeks. Snow still blanketed the yard, but the air was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Hyun-bin worked alongside Ha-eun, their movements synchronized as they fed the animals and cleaned the kennels. For the first time, there was laughter, soft and fleeting, but genuine. As they stood side by side, watching the dogs play in the snow, Ha-eun glanced at him and smiled. "You're staying this time, right?" He looked back at her, his expression softening. "I'm staying." The days that followed were a blur of quiet joy and subtle sorrow. Winter tightened its grip on the city, and the shelter became a haven of warmth and purpose. Choi Hyun-bin threw himself into the work with renewed vigor, sharing tasks with Ha-eun and finding solace in the routine they had built together. The shelter, once teetering on the brink of collapse, began to thrive. The supplies he had discreetly arranged months ago provided a lifeline, and Ha-eun's tireless dedication continued to draw in small but meaningful donations from the local community. Their bond had grown unshakable, built on trust, understanding, and the unspoken knowledge that time was a fragile thread. One snowy morning, as the world outside glowed in shades of white and silver, Ha-eun found Hyun-bin sitting on the steps of the porch, his breath visible in the crisp air. The wiry terrier that had grown attached to him was curled at his feet, its tail thumping rhythmically against the wood. "You're up early," she said, walking toward him with 2 steaming mugs of tea in her hands. He glanced up at her, his smile faint but genuine. "Couldn't sleep. The snow was too quiet." She handed him a mug and sat beside him, her shoulder brushing lightly against his. For a moment, they watched the world in comfortable silence, the steam from their mugs curling into the air like whispers. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice soft. "About what?" "About what happens after," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "To the shelter. To you." Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to meet his words with strength. "You don't have to worry about that," she said. "We'll be okay." He turned to look at her, his expression filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I want to make sure of it. The shelter. It's more than a place. It's a home. For the animals, for you, and for everything I've come to care about." Her eyes softened, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've already given us more than we could have asked for. Don't spend your time worrying about the future. Just be here. With me." Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side to prepare for a fundraising event that would ensure the shelter's future. It was a modest affair, held in the shelter's yard, with strings of twinkling lights casting a warm glow against the snow. Volunteers and donors gathered, laughing and chatting as they met the animals and learned about the work being done. Hyun-bin moved among them, his presence calm and commanding, though his health had begun to visibly wane. Ha-eun stayed close, her watchful eyes catching the moments when his strength faltered. By the end of the night, the shelter had raised enough funds to secure its place for years to come. Ha-eun stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by friends and supporters, her heart full despite the bittersweetness of the moment. Hyun-bin watched her from a distance, his chest tight with emotion. She was radiant, her laughter lighting up the night like the stars above. He wanted to hold on to that image of her forever. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon as Ha-un found him sitting in the small office, a stack of papers spread out before him. He looked up when she entered, his eyes tired but warm. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Making sure everything is in order," he replied, gesturing to the documents. "The shelter's accounts, the donations, my contributions. It's all here." She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. He smiled faintly. "I know." A week later, the snow fell heavy and silent as Ha-un sat by Hyunbin's side in the small room he had claimed as his own. His breathing was shallow, his body weakened by the illness that had steadily taken its toll. The terrier lay curled at his feet, and Ha-un held his hand tightly, her tears falling silently as she watched him struggle to stay present. "Ha-un," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," she said, leaning closer. "You gave me more than I ever deserved," he murmured, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you for letting me love you." Her tears fell harder as she pressed her forehead against his. "And thank you for showing me what it means to love," she whispered. As the snow continued to fall, Choi Hyunbin slipped away, his hand still held tightly in hers. In the days that followed, the shelter became a place of remembrance. The volunteers and donors who had come to know Hyunbin mourned his loss, but they also celebrated the legacy he had left behind. Ha-un threw herself into her work, ensuring that his vision for the shelter was realized. She expanded its reach, turning it into a thriving community hub that not only cared for animals, but also supported local families and volunteers. On the porch steps, where he had often sat with the terrier at his feet, she placed a small plaque. It read, "In loving memory of Choi Hyunbin, a man who gave his heart to this place and left it better than he found it." And every morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered yard, Ha-un found peace in the knowledge that his love and kindness would live on in every life he had touched.